Cailleach. The Cailleach is a difficult, just like Marlon was talking about, how do you describe the Morrigan, the Morrigan? Similarly with the Cailleach, she has many representations and many, I guess, legends attached to her, and she's come right down to pretty much modern times. She's been kept alive in the folklore in a different way than in the kind of accepted sort of literary works, if you like. And I guess from my reading of it, again, it's a little bit of interpretation, but the Cailleach was at once a giant, a hag, a fierce bringer of doom and death, but she was also could transform into a beautiful goddess, tutelary goddess who could confer legitimacy to the king. And I think the way I've tried to understand it, this makes sense for me, hopefully it makes sense for all of you. When it comes to who is the goddess in Irish culture, in Irish stories, it's quite unclear. Often she's given, several different names and different lineage and so on and so forth. So really the Cailleach is another, I guess, personification really of the divine feminine. She really does, at the point where we take up her story mostly, she's really represents landscape, but also the forces that make landscape what it is. So she's just like rain and wind and wave can sculpt, and geological processes throw up different landforms. These were attributed to the goddess in the form of the Cailleach. And so she had the power to transform the landscape. And there's several Cailleach stories. Cailleach, by the way, is variously translated. It can mean hag, it can mean wise woman, it can mean, some people even suggest it's the veil before a nun, all kinds of things. But I think she's really the mother goddess, the earth goddess in later years. So let's say we must have had possibly a Mother Earth Neolithic understanding in our cosmogony, and then when the Gaels came, when the European influences came in, there was the male pantheon, and the female was still very important because she gave legitimacy to the king. She was Ireland, and you heard last week and this week of the different forms that the goddess took and her different roles. But as the Ireland became literate, when the Christians came, and right down into the Middle Ages, the goddess kind of like not exited stage left, but she became less important, and the Cailleach tended to rise. And then the goddess was suddenly a hag that magically transformed into a beautiful woman whenever the to-be king kissed her, like in Niall of the Nine Hostages. Whenever Niall, who had been a stepbrother, his father so Niall of the Nine Hostages was born to a king who had played away from home, or rather he brought a female slave in who had, I think, princess blood in her. And his wife was incredibly jealous. And she did everything she could to make this woman, Karen's, life appallingly difficult. She herself had 4 sons, and her husband was very proud of his sons. And unfortunately, whenever Karen got pregnant, his wife doubled down on her antipathy towards the woman and tasked her with hard labor. to the point, and instructed everybody to give her no, you know, to turn their backs to her, not to entertain her, not to be kind, and all the rest. So whenever she had her baby, she was terrified. She didn't even look at her child. She just turned around and marched back to the castle with her buckets of water or whatever she was doing at the time. And a poet took the child over, and la 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 la. Story goes on. Boy comes of age. He's raised by a poet. He's well versed in all the arts. He's incredibly wise. He's fair. He's got great understanding, wiser than his years. And whenever he comes of age, he decides he's going to reinstate his mother, and he's going to claim his place at the High King's table. And so he comes back in, and of course, the Queen is outraged, appalled that this young man should show up and threaten her son's kingship. So she does all kinds of terrible things. There's lots of different versions of what she did. She tried poison, she tried this, she tried that, whatever. But then this one test that they were given was to go hunting. And the four boys with their stepbrother went off hunting. They were having a great old time, but they'd forgotten to bring water. And so one after the other went looking for water, and each of them encountered the description of the woman goes on for 2 pages in the version I read. Unbelievably ugly, and an old crone, and she's at the source of water at a well, and each of them in turn refuses to kiss her. They're just horrified by her. Whereas Niall, when she asked for a quick kiss in order to get some of the water, he said, so I'll do more than I'll kiss you. I'll look after you right nicely. And he does, and she transforms into a beautiful woman, and the rest is, he's one of the finest kings Ireland ever had, according to the story. So she was one representation of the Cailleach. So what happened, I think, was that in the medieval times, the goddess was downgraded to this L one, and she sort of had a peripheral, showing in the myths, including what Marlon referred to earlier, the old woman washing at the ford. She's often referred to as Cailleach. And one of the stories of the Cailleach, which has been attributed again to Cailleach, which I really love, it's a medieval, I think it's from the 8th century, but it's the story of how Owen Macha got its name, which is the Ulster fort. And there were 3 kings who took it in turns to rule, and they had 7 druids to do the law and to do the spells, and they had 7 great champions each, and they had 7 poets for the they needed 7 poets, and each of them reigned for 7 years in turn until one of them died, and his daughter insisted on having her father's turn. And the other 2 guys was absolutely not. So she routed them in battle. She was quite fierce. And then one of them had children, and she went, and he had 5 sons. And she went and she encountered each of them in turn, and each of them, second guy died, and his sons were trying to lay claim to the kingship, and she sorted them out. She took one of each of them in turn, met them separately, but then she married the remaining one, which is a bit weird because she was, technically his niece. And then he died. That was quite lucky. And then for the sons that were left, she went and encountered each of them in turn, and each of them tried to mate with her, but she tied them up and carried them back by the feet, and placed them in this place in the north of Ireland, in Owen Macha. Her name was Macha, obviously, and she, with her brooch, inscribed a big circle and instructed the 5 lads to build a bloody good fort and to do it quickly. And Owen Macha is not a small place; it's quite a big fort. So that's the story. So she was a giant as well. She was powerful. She was fierce. She was wise. So she's a Cailleach as well. And then going down into more modern times, medieval times onwards, the kayak appears as a banshee, which is the otherworld creature that will announce the impending death of somebody in the house. And her cry is what is kind of the death knell. There's also the banfassa. Banfassa is the Irish for a wise woman. Often kayaky kind of attributes were put on the banfassa because there was a fear. The women, people up until very recently resorted to the banfassa, the wise woman, for cures and for herbal medicine, even just for wisdom. And they weren't well liked. Biddy Early would be a case in point. She was a famous banfassa in County Clare, and the clergy hated her. So did the local doctors. Everybody hated her. All the men in power, rather, hated her. Whereas the locals relied on her for cures and for help and for wisdom. And there's plenty of stories of how she defied the local authorities, including whenever they decided they were going to throw her out of her house. She had a habit of losing husbands. I think 3 died in her. And she married the 4th lad, and he was about, I don't know, 1/3 of her age or something. So there was quite a lot of jealousy and suspicion around her. And anyway, at one stage they decided they were going to kick her out of her house. So the landlord and his agents and the local constable marched up to the house, and she came out all sweetness and light and said, "Now lads, you can just hang on a minute there now. I'm not quite ready." And they were rooted to the spot. You know, they were literally frozen and couldn't move. And she stayed in her property. So all of these things, all of these different traditions, wherever women were exercising power or wisdom or healing or great power, they would be called the Cailleach collectively. And then the other great attribute of the Cailleach was her ability to change the landscape. So the Cailleach of Beara is the one that we know the most about. And the story goes that she was a giant, and she had a row with another Cailleach who was, again, an otherworldly creature with huge powers. And the two of them collected a bunch of stones, and they sat on opposing hilltops, firing them at each other. And the Cailleach Beara deliberately sent her stones further. So the other Cailleach was intent on killing this one. And she was firing hers as accurately as she could at her Cailleach, at the Cailleach Beara. Whereas the other Cailleach was second them anywhere she could, as far away from the one as she could. And eventually the other Cailleach realized that all her stones were gone, and the stones that she had thrown at the Cailleach Beara had amassed into a huge big mound. And the story goes anyhow that the people who were all asleep came up the next morning, and they found that the Cailleach Beara was bleeding and in a very bad state, but she'd already gone and placed a cairn, a burial mound over the opposing Cailleach. And because of how the other Cailleach had been so, how she had thrown things sort of left, right, and center, her mound was a huge big mountain now, big rocks, and it was really nicely formed. Whereas the opposing Cailleach spot, all the rocks had fallen off and fallen down, and eventually they would get covered over, and she wouldn't. Her impact on the landscape was forgotten, whereas the Cailleach Beara had a lovely, lovely mountain. So all of those attributes and stories and all collectively are known as Cailleach stories. And I don't know what much more to say, but I think we're running out of time.